So this lesson looks at the impact of ethnicity on education. Start with a simple question. How much scientific evidence is there to suggest a biological link between skin colour and intelligence? Well, it won't surprise you to learn the answer is zero. The colour of your skin has nothing to do with the intelligence of your brain. However, there is a link between ethnicity and educational attainment. If it's not biological, it must be sociological, something about how our society is structured that means your ethnicity impacts how well you do at school. So as sociologists, it's our task to figure out why. We're going to identify how ethnicity affects educational achievement, and we're going to consider which factors are more significant. We'll look at external and internal factors, those things from outside of school and those things from inside of school. And then you'll write an essay, and your essay will ask you to compare the significance of ethnicity and the impact that has on education with social class, which you've studied previously, because these are not independent factors. Let's go back to the idea of a meritocracy. If education was truly a meritocracy, what would we see when comparing results of different ethnicities? Presumably, there wouldn't be any difference based on your ethnicity. Is this the case? Well, we've seen that it's not. So let's look at why. Let's start by trying to see which ethnic groups do best and which have the lowest educational attainment. Pause the video and put those 8 ethnic groups in order. Okay, so here are the answers. We've picked here the ethnic group who do the best educationally, which are Chinese students, the lowest attainment, which are Irish traveller students, and then in order the 6 largest ethnic groups from Indian, African, Bangladeshi, White British, Pakistani, and then Caribbean. You might look at that and think, well, I'm not surprised Irish travellers struggle the most in education because they travel as part of their culture. Maybe that moving around interrupts their education. But what causes these differences amongst all these other ethnic groups? Let's have a look at those actual differences. I want you to notice a couple of different things from the graph. Firstly, the data is a little bit out of date, but it also shows us a trend, and that trend has been continuing. Can you see that in 2006-07, white British students were ahead of Bangladeshi students, but by 2010-11, both had improved, but Bangladeshi students had caught up. And in the time since, they've pulled ahead. So as everyone has improved slightly, the white British students have actually dropped back by comparison. The other thing I want you to note is how similar all of those figures are, with the exception of the Indian students pulling ahead a bit. Most other students, very similar results, because actually ethnicity doesn't have as big an impact on your educational attainment as social class or even as gender. So we will look at the reasons why, but the reasons we'll be discussing are not as significant as the reasons we discussed in a previous learning when we looked at social class, and that's going to come back later in the lesson. You don't need to copy down that whole graph, but pause the video perhaps just to note down a couple of examples of ethnic groups who do well and those who do below average. Okay, let's consider why. Based on what you've learnt from previous learning, you should already be able to identify some of the factors that affect the attainment of different different ethnic groups in education, because there'll be similar factors we had for gender and for social class. So pause the video and make some notes on what you think those might be. We shouldn't just look at educational attainment when we're considering the impact of ethnicity on education. This graph shows exclusion data. And you might look at it and say, okay, Indian students have the fewest exclusions and they were getting the best results, so that makes sense. If they're doing well in school, they're less likely to get excluded. But look at this massive difference for Caribbean students and those of white and black Caribbean mixed ethnicity. Not doing that much worse educationally than white British students or Pakistani students, and yet massively more exclusions. There's something else going on there as well we might want to explain. So we're going to look at the factors that primarily affect ethnicity. We're going to look at 3 things that primarily affect ethnicity: types of schools, labelling and teacher expectations, and the ethnocentric curriculum. And then we're going to look at the external and internal factors we've considered before. Firstly, when it comes to the factors that really impact ethnicity, start with types of schools. Some ethnic groups are more likely to attend grammar or independent schools. Remember, these schools get better results overall, and students are more likely to go to them if they're from a middle class background. So Given that the Indian community in the UK is more likely to be middle class, Indian students are more likely to go to grammar or independent schools, they're likely to get better results. The Pakistani community is more likely to be working class, they're less likely to go to those schools, they're less likely to get those results. Maybe that explains the difference in educational attainment between Indian students and Pakistani students. Some sociologists have also argued the curriculum is ethnocentric. That means it's culturally biased. It's focused on seeing things from a particular perspective. For example, history is taught from a British perspective, so white British students might already be familiar with a lot of the history they learn in school and find it easier to do well than someone who's studying all of this for the first time and it's new to them. It's not something their family would know about or would teach them about. Similarly, students study European languages like French and Spanish. Those are similar to English. There might be a lot of words that are cognate or semi-cognate. So if English is your first language, you might find it easier to pick up French or Spanish. On the other hand, if your first language is an Asian or an African language, you might find it harder to pick up French and Spanish, and therefore your grades won't be as good. So that's the concept that the formal curriculum is ethnocentric. On the other hand, if that was the only explanation, it might suggest why British students should get the best results. And as we've seen, they actually fall behind a lot of the other ethnic groups. Some sociologists have argued it's the hidden curriculum that is ethnocentric. Hidden curriculum, that's things like uniform, punctuality, behaviour. And some sociologists have argued that these rules in school fit the norms and values that students would have learnt at home because of the culture in which they've grown up. If the universal standards at school are the same as the particularistic standards of your family or your culture, you might find it easier to do well in school. An example sometimes mentioned in this is punctuality within the African religious community. So you might not know this, but there's a massive difference between religious church services in Europe and in Africa. European services tend to be quite short. They last only an hour. And given that that's the most important worship time of your week, if you're a religious person, it's really important that you're there on time. So punctuality is really valued in those communities. The African church services can go on all day, sometimes about 5 hours. And people don't usually go to the whole of the service. Some people go at the beginning and leave partway through. Some people arrive in the middle and stay for the end. Some people are there to start and then go away and then come back to clear up. So in that culture, punctuality isn't as much of a value, is it? You're not as important to be there on time if actually turning up partway through is part of the norms of how that culture works. Now, that doesn't mean that one culture is better than another. And if you're the person who's there on time, are you any better than the person who stays behind at the end and clears up? But it might mean that if punctuality isn't a norm that you have in your culture, when you come to school and you have to be punctual for everything, you always have to be on time for every lesson all the way through the day, you're going to find it harder to fit into that than someone who's been taught about the importance of punctuality as part of their culture. And therefore, if you're from that ethnic group, you might just be late a bit more often, get in trouble for punctuality more often, and therefore not do as well in school. On the other hand, you might have been listening to that and saying, well, that was an interesting example, but it applied to African students. And yet African students do better in school. They're one of the better achieving ethnic groups. Maybe it explains why Chinese or Indian students do so well, but it doesn't fully explain everything. It was Black Caribbean students who had the lower educational attainment. So maybe there's something else going on. When it comes to Caribbean students, some sociologists argue that that's something else that's going on is institutional racism. We saw that very high rate of exclusions for Caribbean students. You can see exactly the same high rate of punishment for Black Caribbean people in the criminal justice system. They're more likely to be arrested, they're more likely to face more severe punishments. And some sociologists have argued that this is because of institutional racism in the criminal justice system. There are fewer people of Black Caribbean heritage working in the police, working in the legal system. Police officers and lawyers aren't as sympathetic to the concerns of the Caribbean community, and therefore maybe there are some assumptions, maybe some racist assumptions that lead to decisions that get Caribbean people more arrests and tougher sentences. If we see that same high rate of punishment for Black Caribbean children in schools, maybe schools suffer from that same institutional racism that people have accused the criminal justice system of having. Or maybe it's not as institutionalized, maybe it's a little bit more to do with the interactions students have with their teachers. You learnt about labeling when you looked at working class underachievement, and the same might be said of different ethnic groups. When a teacher sees a student in their class, a Chinese or an Indian student, they might just assume they're going to be hardworking, they're going to be well behaved, and then if the student doesn't hand in their homework one week, maybe they're particularly strict in calling the parents and making sure the student does the work for the following week because they expect them to do so. So they expect those interventions are going to have an impact on that student. Maybe if they have a black or a traveller student in their class, they kind of assume they're not going to do all of their work or do their work as well. Maybe when they hand in a piece of homework that's really not very good, the teacher just gives them a low mark and moves on. They don't hold them to account because they kind of assumed they were going to underachieve. And therefore it becomes what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. By assuming that the student won't do as well, the teacher sets lower expectations, and then the student doesn't do as well. So perhaps that's the reason why certain ethnic groups have different levels of educational attainment than others. Those are the reasons put forward that relate to ethnicity. But we also need to consider those things we did that relate to social class. I mentioned earlier that certain ethnic groups are more likely to be of working class and some are more likely to be middle class. Think about those external factors that affect working class underachievement. Material deprivation, not being able to afford equipment, pay for tutors or computers. Cultural capital, not having that wider knowledge of society, not being encouraged to read as much. Remember, if you've got someone, a parent who's middle class, they're more likely to be in a high paying job. They're more likely to have succeeded in education themselves when they were at school. So maybe they're going to be really good at helping their children with their homework. A working class parent maybe didn't succeed at school, maybe has to work 2 jobs, work evenings and shift work in order to make ends meet, has less time and less skill to help their children with their homework. Maybe that's why they don't do as well. We also considered language and how middle class parents might use more formal language within the home. So when students encounter it in exams, they're more familiar with it. Maybe there's a more restricted vocabulary in working class families. That's likely to be even more exaggerated if English isn't your first language within a family. If people aren't speaking English as much at the home, they're even less likely to use more formal English vocabulary in the home. So maybe these factors that affected working class students just especially apply to working class ethnic minority students. And those students who are from an ethnic minority are therefore more likely to underachieve because of that class background. We can compare those external factors with the internal factors, types of school, labelling. Maybe that's as much to do with class as it is to do with ethnicity, or maybe it is the ethnocentric curriculum and the institutional racism that particularly affects groups of certain ethnic communities. Next task for you to do is to have a think. You've encountered all of these factors now affecting both ethnicity and class. Think about your own experience, your own family background, the students you know in school. Which of these factors do you think are most significant? And here's your task. Say which one is most significant, give an example and an explanation. There's an extension there for you to think about as well. Pause the video and complete the task. Okay, I don't know which one you thought was most significant, but it is very important for sociologists to work out why, because governments want to reduce these gaps in education and they need to know what the causes are so they know what the solutions need to be. If, for example, this underachievement amongst ethnic communities is really just to do with the material deprivation amongst those communities, and it's really just a feature of working class students doing less well than middle class students, then government need to do things to make up for that material deprivation. Maybe providing more schools or more tutors more computers in schools, maybe more after-school tutoring within schools, maybe more money for intervention to make up for that. On the other hand, if it's all to do with the institutional racism within schools, then the government needs to be hiring more teachers from those communities who underachieve, people who've been through the experience themselves and can motivate and have high expectations of students from those communities. So it's very important sociologists correctly understand what the reasons are. Okay, apologies for the PowerPoint flicking there. Time for you to do some exam questions. Here's another graph similar to the one we looked at earlier, but I'm not going to talk you through it this time. I want you to look at it for yourself. And what does item A tell you about educational achievement amongst different ethnic groups? Remember to give some data to back up your answer for both marks. And give one explanation for those differences. So pick one of the explanations we've studied and try and explain it. And 4 marks for that. So make sure you've got a full P paragraph with an example and explanation, and you link it explicitly to what is item A. Pause the video, give yourself about 6 minutes to complete that task. Okay, so you'll have seen from the data shows a similar story to what we saw earlier with certain ethnic groups like Chinese or Indian students doing better than others. So hopefully you've got some numerical data to say that's what the graph shows you. In terms of your explanation, you needed to pick something. Maybe Indian and Chinese students doing better because of the type of school they go to. Maybe they're more likely to be middle class, whereas Pakistani or Caribbean students more likely to be working class. Maybe you picked on the underachievement of black Caribbean boys and focused on labelling or institutional racism. Only had to be one explanation for that question. Isn't some more exam questions? Item B, give one weakness of the research mentioned in item B. So you're going to have to identify the research method and remember the weakness of it. And then give one other explanation for the educational differences mentioned. So there'll be some explanations in the item. You need to give a separate explanation. Item B, in her participant observations of black male working class students in a South London comprehensive in 2018, Dara identified what she called the academic roadman, who demonstrated anti-school values outside of lessons to gain respect from their peers, yet worked hard within lessons as they wanted to succeed. She therefore argued that culture, those anti-school values, was not the cause of their underachievement, and instead focused on the curriculum and assessments. Pause the video, give yourself 6 minutes to explain a weakness of her research and another explanation for the differences she noted. So in terms of the weakness, it was a participant observation. So she was taking part in the lessons. She wasn't getting reliable quantitative data. She wasn't accurately recording exactly how often the students did different things, so that she had numerical data she could compare to, say, students of a different ethnic group. So her data not as reliable as it could have been. And also, she's only studied one particular group of students. She hasn't studied black middle class students. She hasn't studied students in independent schools. Maybe her observations wouldn't apply in those other places. So maybe her data isn't fully representative. And give one other explanation. Well, the item mentioned having anti-school values and anti-school culture. It mentioned the curriculum and assessments. You might remember some issues from male underachievement to do with those. So you should have explained one issue that it didn't mention, for example, labelling from teachers. Okay, the essay then. Discuss how far class is a more significant factor in educational achievement than ethnicity. So to answer this question, you're going to go back to previous learning and explain the reasons for class differences in attainment, explaining material deprivation and cultural deprivation. On the other hand, you're going to have to consider some factors that only affect certain ethnic groups, perhaps the ethnocentric curriculum, perhaps the institutional racism. You have to be able to link them together. Well, on the one hand, it's labelling of working class students, but on the other hand, labelling is more likely to happen for certain ethnic groups, so link those together. Ultimately, you've got to explain class is more significant than ethnicity because the gaps in attainment are higher between middle class and working class students than they are between different ethnic groups. And perhaps you can argue that actually the differences in attainment to do with ethnicity are because of those class differences. Or maybe you want to argue those things that primarily apply to ethnic groups, such as the ethnocentric curriculum, or maybe their language skills. Those are significant as well. Use as many key terms as you can. Go back through the PowerPoint, look at all the key terms, mention the external and the internal factors in your answer. Pause the video, give yourself 12 to 15 minutes to complete that task. Remember to share your essays and all of your exam questions with your teachers. Hopefully you have successfully identified how ethnicity affects educational achievement, and you have used lots of key terms in your answer, evaluating which factors you think are most significant. If so, you've successfully met the success criteria and completed the lesson. So, well done.